Welcome. This is the Free Market Roadshow, probably the largest annual series of public conferences on economics. Remarkable experts are discussing the challenges and providing libertarian solutions to today's problems. Organized by the Austrian Economic Center in cooperation with select institutes, universities and think tanks, the Free Market Roadshow tours all over Europe. Today we pay a visit to Blagoevgrad.
Hello, my name is Robert White. I am the Dean of Faculty and Interim Provost at the American University in Bulgaria. AUBG was founded in September 1991 following the fall of communism with the mission of preparing students for life in a democratic society. AUBG has been a proud partner of the Free Market Roadshow for the last 4 years. Over this time, our students have debated free market ideas with prominent international thinkers. We are grateful to the Austrian Economic Center, Friedrich Naumann Foundation for Freedom, and the Free Market Roadshow's other sponsors for helping us to bring these speakers to campus. We are disappointed that we cannot have an event on campus this year. However, we are happy that the Free Market Roadshow is continuing as a virtual event. Over the past year, governments worldwide have imposed controls on their citizens that in some countries is unprecedented. Our university has been prevented by law from holding on-ground classes, despite introducing policies that protect faculty, staff, and students effectively. The Free Market Roadshow creates a forum in which students and intellectuals can question and debate the legitimacy of government policies. We're happy to be partnering with the Free Market Roadshow for a 5th year. We're looking forward to another stimulating event.
Hello and welcome to the second event of the Free Market Roadshow here at the American University in Bulgaria, which has its main campus in the city of Blagoevgrad, but of course I am currently in Sofia, Bulgaria. We are very pleased to have a second event. This is the first time we have 2 events on our virtual campus, and the first event a month ago was on democracy and civil rights. The second event is on the need for free trade. As the event was promoted on social media, one of the followers reacted saying that there is no need for free trade, which in the light of the past 30 or so years is somehow surprising, especially when it comes from a person from this part of the world, say Southeastern Europe, an area which has greatly benefited from opening to international trade, opening to the world, both in terms of political freedoms, economic wealth and growth, and cultural dynamism. So today's topic, and by the way, you just have seen my dog walking around here, so don't be afraid of that. It's a tiny little beast. The free trade, got distracted a little bit, is a hot topic in these times of lockdowns, gridlocks, of isolation, calls for protectionism, and questioning of liberal political order. We are pleased to have Daniel Hanna, a writer, a journalist and a former politician from England, to be our keynote speaker for today's event. Now, Daniel is currently serving as an advisor for the Board of Trade, which is a governmental body with the Department of International Trade of the British government. And he's also the founding president of the Initiative for Free Trade, which is a think tank which promotes free trade, as the name suggests, of course. He's a member of the Conservative Party in the UK. He was a long-time member of the European Parliament for South East England from 1999 until 2020, and one of the founders of Vote Leave. That is an organization which was heavily campaigning to leave the European Union during the 2016 referendum over there. Hannan is a prominent journalist. He has written columns for a number of journals. Those include the Sunday Telegraph, the International Business Times, the Washington Examiner, and occasionally columns for the Guardian and the Daily Telegraph. He is also the author of several books on the political dimensions of the UK-EU relationship. We're pleased to have Dana's keynote speech.
Free trade, one of the greatest blessings a government can bestow on its people, is in almost every country unpopular. So wrote Lord Macaulay, the Whig politician, the historian, poet, and Indian administrator. He wrote those words in 1824. Think of how much more aptly they apply today. Which is extraordinary, isn't it? Because since Lord Macaulay's time, according to Deirdre McCluskey's calculations, the human race has experienced something like a 3,000% increase in living standards as a result of globalization and increased specialization and exchange. Free trade was, prior to the coronavirus, mopping up the last few remaining puddles of poverty on the planet. And the effect was most marked, particularly in those Asian and African countries that were leaving previously closed, autarkic, self-reliant systems and joining the global economy. So why is it, when we've seen the miraculous effects, that it's so unpopular? Why is it, when we've seen the extraordinary falls in infant mortality, in adult mortality, in diseases, when we've seen the extraordinary rises in education and so on, why, when we've seen the pacifying effects of free trade, the way in which since 1945 countries have been less likely to go to war with each other because they don't have to quarrel and squabble about resources anymore, why are we opposing the thing that has worked this wonder? Well, I've given this a lot of thought, and I think there are three fundamental explanations, and I'm going to group them broadly as follows. There's a psychological explanation, a political explanation, and what I can only call an aesthetic explanation. Let's start with the psychological one. Free trade just feels wrong, right? It feels weird. It doesn't accord with the instincts and intuitions that were embedded by a million years of human intuitions. We have an instinct that makes us want to hoard food so as to get through the winter, right? We want to be able to see it there. We don't want to rely on invisible strangers. And so the assertions made by the mercantilists and the protectionists, we need to protect our strategic industries, we need to make sure we've got enough food grown in our own country, we can't compete with poor countries with slave wages, we can't afford a permanent trade balance. All of those things feel right. They are intuitive. But every single one, when turned into policy, serves to make a country poorer than it needed to be. And that's why in every generation, from Macaulay's to ours, the protectionists and the mercantilists have always been able to make this appeal to what seems like common sense. And then there's the political reason, and I can summarize that in 4 words. Free trade brings dispersed gains, concentrated losses. When Donald Trump applies steel tariffs, he may very slightly slow the decline of the US steel sector. He may prop up at least for a few years, some of the 125,000 odd jobs in steel production. But at a far greater cost in the 7 million downstream steel-using sectors, construction, aeronautics, car building, and all the rest. It is always and everywhere true that trade restrictions do damage net to the country that applies them. But the politics don't always match the economics. So let's suppose that the steel tariffs were taken off tomorrow. Right? Immediately the US economy would get a slight boost. Prices would fall. All of those companies that use them in construction and car making and so on would get an immediate productivity boost without needing to do anything else. They'd be able, other things being equal, to take on more workers. Those workers would start paying taxes. Everyone would be a little bit better off. And at the end of that process, not one American would say, I'm $64 better off this year, or whatever it is, I'm going to vote for the guy who took that tariff off. But the losers, the former steel workers in Flint, Michigan, or wherever it is, they will know exactly whom to blame and they will vote accordingly. And that's why countries again and again act against their interests, because the politics dictate it. The most flagrant example of this in the US, by the way, is sugar. American sugar is about twice the price of global sugar, right? It's quoted separately in a lot of stock exchanges, and that's been true almost since the revolution. Why? Because there is a sugar-producing lobby based in Florida that heavily funds both parties, that runs PACs, and that has lobbied extensively to keep sugar out of the US. Result? Well, many more jobs are lost in downstream industries, in confectionery and candy making. There's a reason, right, that those American chocolate bars taste bad. It's because they're made with corn syrup, because the sugar is out of reach. And yet, because the sugar jobs are concentrated in Florida, because Florida is a key state, no administration is ever going to say, I would rather have 6 or 7 or 8 more jobs downstream in food processing, because those people don't know who they are, they can't vote for me. I will prop up the powerful and well-connected lobby in Florida. So we've got the psychological problem, we've got the political problem, which brings me onto what I can only call the aesthetic problem. Right? The Victorian novelist Anthony Trollope once said, "Poverty, to be scenic, should be rural." And I think that sentiment underlines an awful lot of the thinking behind Western aid and development. I grew up in Lima, Peru. Lima, in the 1970s, was a city surrounded by shantytowns. They stretched away in all directions on the slopes of the surrounding hills. Barriadas, they were called, Las Barriadas de Lima. And what would happen? When I was growing up, friends would come from Britain, from Europe, from the US, and they would do the usual thing that people do when they visit Peru, right? They would stay with us for a few days, and then they'd fly to Cusco, they'd visit Machu Picchu, they'd do the Inca Trail, they'd come back, and almost always, they would ask the same question. Why is it, they would say, why is it that people are leaving these pristine, beautiful Andean villages and coming down here to the slums to live among the open sewers and the traffic fumes? That was a very first world question. No Peruvian ever needed to ask why somebody would leave a mountain village where there was no electricity, no clean running water, no clinic, no school, no job. The people in the shantytowns, the people in the barriadas, understood in a way that some Western aid analysts affect not to, or maybe don't understand, that the slum is a transitional phase, transitional for the individual passing through it, and transitional in the developmental phase of the country. Britain went through the same process, so did every other industrialized nation, and you come out of it richer, longer lived, with better education, with better living standards in every way. But of course, it's not pretty, right? And so we've built this whole industry in our school textbooks, in our documentaries, in our government policy, based around a fundamentally aesthetic objection that says, oh, how awful, here are these poor women in Vietnam, stitching sneakers together for 50 cents a day or whatever it is. Well, you wouldn't want to work in a sweatshop in Vietnam, neither would I. But let's not deny agency to the people involved. Let's consider that they might be making a rational, self-interested decision. You and I have not faced an alternative of bending our backs in the paddy fields dawn to dusk. And maybe those employees understand that it's a transitional phase. Maybe they understand that the wages earned by an employee of a foreign country, company in a country like Vietnam are roughly twice the national average. And certainly they would understand that if we really want to help them, you know what we can do? We can buy more of their stuff, and we can sell them more of our stuff cheaply, and that will raise living standards, and as it raises living standards and puts upward pressure on wages, so it will improve working conditions. It's the same process that every country goes through as long as there is a free market system. Now, here is the depressing thing. All of those arguments were hard enough to win in 2019, before the coronavirus struck. They are going to be much harder to win coming out of the epidemic and its associated lockdowns. They're going to be much harder to win with a world population that has now been habituated over the last 12 months to a far warier and more protectionist and more introverted outlook. The number of people who have said to me over the past year things like, well, surely, Hannan, even you must now understand why we need to grow more of our own food. Come on, really? Really, that's your take from the last 12 months? The coronavirus hit this country at the height of what our farmers call the hungry gap, right? That period between late March and early May when we do not produce any food in any quantity in this country. We've reached the end of the winter harvests. We're not producing any more cabbages or potatoes or turnips. We haven't yet reached the first of the main harvests. Had it not been for the ability to import what we needed when we needed it, we would have been living on rhubarb and asparagus, maybe a little bit of nettle soup. That is what we grow during the hungry gap. But of course, imports function perfectly well. The real lesson we should have learned over the past 12 months is how important imports are. If the vaccine row, the rush to be able to get your hands on vaccines produced wherever they are in the world teaches us one thing, it should be that. But of course, we're not looking at this with our rational minds. We're looking at it with our caveman instincts. Of course we do. It's what people do in a crisis. So I'm afraid that free marketeers, people who have got some knowledge of economics and how it works empirically, are going to need to go back to first principles and explain these necessarily counterintuitive and difficult truths. That the best way to spread wealth and opportunity, the best way to spread peace and happiness, is by removing obstacles and allowing businesses and customers to interact without government interference. It's the same basic formula that works every time. It raised Britain to be the richest country in the world in the 19th century. Same magic formula that worked for Hong Kong and Singapore in the 20th century, for Australia and New Zealand in the 21st. Find me a free trading country anywhere in the world that is not, over time, getting significantly richer. But we need to go out and show why that works, because it seems surprising, it seems to run up against common sense. So let's go out and make the most basic moral case in the way that Lord Macaulay would have done for free trade as the ultimate instrument of poverty alleviation, of conflict resolution, and of social justice.
Indeed, free trade as an instrument for social justice as well. We often speak of the last 2.5 centuries as rather an exceptional period of the history of our civilization, where we have properly observed and understood, to some extent, the rationale for free trade, the reasons, the logical reasons behind the free trade, and given it a lot of content However, it has often been challenged. And Daniel Hanna makes here a point saying that our caveman mentality. Now I have the pleasure to introduce our first panelist here today. That is Daniel Kaddik, another Daniel. Daniel is the executive director of the European Liberal Forum, that is the political foundation of the European Liberal Party, the ALDE party. But Daniel, for many, many years, has been the director of the South Office of the Friedrich Naumann Foundation for Freedom, based in Sofia, Bulgaria. So Daniel is a connoisseur of my country and of course of the region. The foundation is promoting, of course, liberal values, the rule of law, of which we need a lot, and economic freedom, which is, of course, the topic of our today's event. Now, the foundation also provides policy consultations and educational programs and is active in more than 60 countries. Daniel has had extensive work experience in countries like Germany, India, and Russia, so he has this overall knowledge of different cultural, political, and economic frameworks. Daniel also has received his degrees in governmental studies from the University of Erfurt, the European studies from the University of Hamburg, and international studies from the University of Birmingham. Now, Daniel, you have observed the changes in South and East Europe and around the world for the last 15, 20 years. And this free trade momentum, which Lord Hanna says, has wiped out the last puddles of misery and poverty around the world. Is free trade enough to promote human flourishing, to promote progress, to promote improvement, economically, of course, but also politically? And is it by itself a sufficient drive for betterment?
Thank you very much for that, and thank you very much for having me. Free trade alone will not save the day, but I think it's a very important ingredient in the basket of freedom that ensures prosperity all around the world. And I think Dan made a very interesting point, and that is about the shoes, the people in Asian countries. And I would like to make the argument that I've been making for a long time. And that is, when I was growing up in the 1980s, I now have to say, everything that I saw, like these little plastic figurines, they were all made in Taiwan. Made in Taiwan was basically a slur, like sometimes made in China is being used as a slur. Made in Taiwan today means something very different. Just as Taiwan, Vietnam, and other countries, when they open up, they allowed prosperity to happen through trade. And being it in Germany, in Belgium, or in Taiwan, I think most people that you ask would rather live in 2021 than 1980, 1960, or before that, despite the global pandemic that is going on at the moment. Why? Because most likely, I will die of old age. I will see all my children grow up. And this is true for more people today than at any point in history before. In the last 100 years, we made more progress than in the 100,000 years before that. And trade is an important point in this mix. So it is, I think, time for some positivity, for some grounded optimism. However, we can have the basket, but if there is a lack of understanding where prosperity comes from, or what the lack of prosperity looks like, we have a problem. Because trade is very often seen as a zero-sum game. Somebody wins, somebody loses. But it is not a zero-sum game. It's a win-win. It's a division of labor on the grander scale. Why do you buy your chairs at IKEA? Why do you buy your laptop from Lenovo or Apple? And why don't you make those things by yourself? Because there's somebody who can do it better for a cheaper price. So beyond division of labor, trade is peaceful exchange. voluntary exchange. And how important these things are can be very much seen by a very big social experiment that was conducted in Germany until 1990, the GDR versus the Federal Republic. A repressive system with restriction on voluntary exchange and trade, and an open system with a market economy and very much integrated in international trade. And while the system in the West provided consumers with a diverse variety of goods, the planned economy in the East was unable to do so. In 1989, each Western German consumed around 80 kilos of fruits brought in from all around the world, while in Eastern Germany they only had 32 kilos. Compared to the West, the East productivity was officially 49%, which seems a bit exaggerated, as we do now, when investigating production logs of the GDR companies after unification. So the the East GDP was around 1/3 of the West, putting productivity around between 20 and 30%. And even after spending over 2 trillion euros in the east of Germany, the East has still not picked up entirely. With massive infrastructure and renovation programs, Germany invested in the very cities that were neglected for so long. As a result, many places in Eastern Germany look now better than the West. Yet, despite all efforts, the East is only 70% as productive compared to the West. While the West has an overall unemployment of 5.4%, the East has 7.9%. Highly skilled R&D work is still to be found in the West. The East remains in a GDP per capita of only 67% of the average. So the strongest state in the East, Saxony, only has half the GDP per capita than the city of Hamburg in the West. So not understanding this, not having seen this, especially in the young generation, I think poses a tremendous risk for the free trade and the economic freedom that we have. And this is fueled by the fact that we live in times of uncertainty, increased by the speed of information. And this uncertainty breeds fear and it breeds skepticism. And unfortunately, skepticism, fear often lead to scapegoating. We want to find somebody who's responsible that we can assert the blame on, as also Dan was mentioning. Trump is an example with the steel that actually was hurting the economy at large and the consumer at large. And if we expand that now to something that was before, the rejection of TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade Investment Partnership, the EU GDP would have grown by 0.5% from that alone per year after 2030. An increased national income of an average 0.3%, increased wages of 0.5%, both for low and high skilled workers, an export increase of 27% for the EU and 35.7% for the US. So everything would have looked good if it wasn't for the caveman mentality that Dan was actually mentioning. Uncertainty breeds fear, especially if you have the feeling that life gets then worse. But life is not getting worse, the world is getting more complex. So in these times when it becomes ever harder for us to defend to make our argument, not because of the factual indicators, but the feeling that people have, we indeed must reduce it to the core questions, and we need to educate more where prosperity comes from. That's why we have a rise of socialist students all around the Western world, because they don't understand where prosperity comes from. And this is where we need to attack, if you will. We need to explain better, we need to show, and we need to show what the alternatives are. The alternatives to the free trade, open economic system that we have is a lack of bananas, fruits, consumer goods, and your precious iPhones that you are trading with the US and Asia.
Indeed, the lack of bananas. Well, for myself, having grown in the 80s here in Bulgaria, I quite well remember those times when bananas and citrus fruits were available only for New Year's. But this idea of uncertainty and lack of capacity to say foresee a solid future, or to feel secure in an environment, brings here another question. What I like to insist on with my students in my microeconomics classes is that economic interactions, trade, and any form of, say, contractual agreement is based on, of course, the proper definition of property rights. And those property rights will be based on the ideas of, let's say it in Latin, usus, fructus, and abusus. That is the possibility to use, manage, and benefit from the assets that we possess and we control. And this requires something else and something more than sheer economic logic. Or basically, to put it differently, it feeds economic logic. And that's a proper political framework and a legal system. Now let me bring you back 30 years, 32 years ago, when changes in Eastern Europe were knocking on the door, and when countries like Bulgaria, but also Romania, did choose to have a different kind of transition. Not the shock therapy which was used and relied upon in Central Europe, but the rather gradualistic approach of soft management of this transition. The result was, and still is, not very good, to be honest. And both Romania and Bulgaria, but also other countries from the Balkan region, are still lagging behind their Central European counterparts. That allows me to introduce our second panelist today, Georgiana Constantin-Parke, who is joining us from Detroit, Michigan. Georgiana is an instructor and a subject matter expert at the Liberty University, and she has been a long-time collaborator for the Market for Ideas in Bucharest. She has a degree in law from the Romanian American University, and she holds a PhD in political science from the University of Bucharest. Also, she has published on various topics, including international humanitarian law and the variety of legal institutions in the context of Romanian integration in the EU. Georgiana, did we not forget the importance of the rule of law, the fact that economics is a moral science? Back then, when we started the transition in the East, were we not overly enthusiastic about this liberalization, about this newfound freedom, that we only focused on allowing for free trade, liberalizing the markets, perhaps not all of them, of course, but not having the institutions which will support those markets? Basically, was transition in the East flowed by the very, very start?
Hello, and thank you for having me. Yes, I think that it's been a very difficult transition for my country, your country, you know, and the Balkans in general, Romania, Bulgaria. And I think it wasn't necessarily, you can see that it was because people were enthusiastic. They definitely had this wonderful dream of what capitalism is going to bring, what the free market is going to bring, because they had heard about it. In my case in Romania, there was this big TV show. I don't know if you guys had it in Bulgaria. It was called Dallas, from over here in the US. And I believe the intention for that show was to show the people the greed of capitalism. But what it really showed them was that they had phones in their cars that they could answer, and that they had a lot of food on their table, and then they could afford a lot of things. And so a lot of people saw the good parts of capitalism. So there were a lot of people expecting a certain thing, which was this immediate prosperity because this magic of democracy had finally come to them. Unfortunately, they of course didn't have the tools necessary to implement democracy. They didn't really necessarily have the tools to understand democracy. And when the transition started, the transition that I actually lived through, I was born in '89. And as I was growing up, I could see a lot of remnants of the communist everything, the communist mentality, the communist state. And I could see the transitions that took place from a non-free market to a free market. Unfortunately, the people who were in power were the same people who were in power during the communist regime. So the fact that nobody understood that all of a sudden, overnight, you can't just say, well, now I'm all about democracy. I'm no longer a communist. And it doesn't really work like that. I think they were just too busy surviving, to be completely honest. I mean, it was horrible times. Coming out of '89, they didn't have enough food. They could barely find anything on the market. And so the people were busy surviving and the politicians were busy lining their pockets. And it is unfortunately, to a certain degree, true to this day. But the importance of a legal framework that supports the free market can't be understated. You can't have a free market without a good and stable political system. Of course, you need protection of your private property, right? You need protection of your person. You need protection of capital. You need enforcement of contracts. You need personal security, the ability for legal recourse against the offender, and freedom from violence. All of these things they're not necessary, they're vital in order for people to be free within the market, to do what they need to do, which is trade and seek their self-interest. So unfortunately, we're not there yet. We in Romania, at least, we still have a very corrupt state. We still have very corrupt politicians. And unfortunately, as Daniel also said, the younger generation does not understand what exactly it is, first, that socialism was, and second, what exactly is causing the prosperity that we are seeing during these days, because we're obviously doing a lot better than we were doing in '89. I've noticed here in the United States, people, and especially young people, they'll be tempted to say socialism is a good thing because of the words that socialism uses to describe itself: social justice, freedom for everybody, all of these things that sound great, but they're actually a hijacking of language, and they are also absolutely untrue in practice. They can be excused for misunderstanding. They cannot be excused for voting according to those misunderstandings, because the principal responsibility of a free individual is education. But my people in Romania, they're very anti-socialist, or so they say, because once a socialist reform is right in front of them, they can't recognize it. So they can go out and say, we don't want to vote for the Socialist Democrat Party anymore. We're going to vote for this party because obviously this party is something different, right? And then that particular party comes out and says, well, we need the government to intervene in this particular matter, and we need more control. There were people out there saying that vaccinations should be obligatory for everybody. That's a long discussion, but that implies more power to the state. That implies that the state all of a sudden takes over a lot of your freedoms. They didn't understand that. Just because it came from a different party, it must not have been socialist, correct? It must not have been authoritarian. It must not have been something that gives the state too much power. So the illusion of I think I know where freedom comes from is a dangerous one. And it's different in the United States than it is in Romania, for instance. I'm sure that there are different countries with different cultures that understand it in different ways. But it is very dangerous for us to actually let it go. Because in the meantime, once you've built a state that does have this wonderful framework for the free market to go on, and you don't educate the public to understand that that's where their freedom comes from, and that's where prosperity comes from, you can lose it. And the battle of ideas nowadays is already kind of going out the window because of this misunderstanding. So I think education is incredibly important. Education on what the rule of law is, what its connection is with the free market, and what these two things, these symbiotic things and amazing relationships, what they do for individual freedom. There is no perfect system. There's never going to be heaven on earth, unless there, you know, you have a religious view, and that's something, a completely different story. But this is the closest thing we have to something that actually respects us as individuals and respects our choices and helps us live a free life.
Yeah, indeed, it helps us live a free and to give an extent a happy life. But it is true that even in the use of the word liberalism, we can be somehow confused. For instance, in the US, it's not a mystery for anyone, liberalism stands for ideas which would be understood as socialist or social democratic here in Europe. So in our discussion today, liberalism will be used in the classical meaning, say the European meaning of the word, that is a doctrine and ideology promoting free trade, political and economic freedom. But this link between the rule of law, the legal framework, and system, and the freedom to operate, to act, to manage, to do business is not only crucial, it is in the very fabric of economics as a science, and the economy is a field of human action. And Adam Smith famously wrote that mankind has the natural propensity to truck, barter, and exchange, driven by some invisible hand. Will all the participants to the market reach, or at least aim towards a betterment, towards an improvement, towards a situation where the positive sum game of exchange can be felt. So now I turn to our third panelist today, Professor Pencho Penchev. He's a professor of economics, just like me, but unlike him, I'm not a full professor. But he's Bulgarian, just like me, which just illustrates that nobody's perfect. But Pencho is one of the most respected and renowned specialists of not only the history of economic thought, which is the study of the doctrines and the evolution of the economic theory, but also on the history of the economy. He is the person to ask and the person to discuss with all about economic life in the late 19th, early 20th century in the Balkans. On top of that, I have the pleasure to have him as a co-author in a recent paper. So it is a genuine pleasure to introduce Pencho to the discussion today. And I will turn to him saying, the need for free trade is obvious. And it is a logical consequence that we turn towards free trade. But would free trade be compatible with all political systems, say empires, and then republics? We have had quite a dynamic history here in the Balkans the last 200 years. Was free trade rather a victim of our historical development, or was it an achievement of our efforts over the last 200 years?
Okay, thank you for having me. And before answering to your question, just as a side note, I'd like to say that in order to convince, I'm not going to blame young people for or younger generation for their misunderstanding of free trade and all the other freedoms, but we have to convince them that this idea free trade and of liberty in general is a sexy and clever idea. So that's that just as a side note to the general discussion. Now, turning back to your question, well, speaking from somewhat obscure Balkan country, I could say that well, free trade is perfectly compatible, even with from historical perspective, even from the perspectives of the less developed countries that are not at the core of the economic growth and development. And next point I'd like to develop is, well, speaking about free trade and the historical perspective of free trade is to some extent, optimistic but negative point. I mean, what is going on if we don't have free trade? And there are a lot of quite convincing examples that if we don't have free trade, uh, in all countries, not only on the Balkans, but around the world, these countries and their people, they are going to have huge problems. For example, you know, today we consider Japan or China as well-developed or developing countries, but in fact, in 15th century, China decided, the big Chinese government decided to isolate the country from the rest of the world. And as a result, and then in the next decades and centuries, there were also this policy of isolationism in China. And as a result, they missed the age of discoveries. They missed the Industrial Revolution. They missed the scientific revolution. And this resulted in a lot of suffering and among ordinary people in China. We have the same case in Japan, where for about 200 years, 1790 to mid 19th century, Japan was forcefully isolated from the rest of the world, and they also missed the Industrial Revolution, and they were forced to catch up with the developed Western countries after the opening of the country. And now coming back here on Balkans, we have to be happy with free trade because in 19th century, you know, Bulgaria was part of the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottoman Empire in 19th century was opening for the rest of the world. And as a result of this opening, we have enrichment of Bulgarians, which were quite poor before this, and we have the liberation of the country, and so on and so forth. So the case for free trade is, I think, universal. Of course, there are some peculiarities. Of course, you can always find some country which was not a free trade country in certain period, and there was some economic growth. But in general, this is important. And speaking of free trade, I am proud to think, and I wish to remind to all of our listeners that you know, we are on the shoulders of giants like, let's say, Adam Smith or David Ricardo or Richard Cobden or Frederick Bastiat or John Stuart Mill, Ludwig von Mises, and so on and so forth. All these people, these are not just that old economists or some obscure people. These are really great people with important ideas for the general human flourishing, not only for material well-being. And speaking of this, well, perhaps I'm going a little bit out of economics, but it is important to know that free trade, again, from historical perspective, promotes peace. And that's and you can see that, for example, in the 20th century, before the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, there was in Europe and in the rest of the world, there was this revival of protectionism, increasing tariffs, and so on and so forth. And this contributed to the other tensions which resulted in the First World War. That was the situation before the outbreak of the Second World War in 1939. Again, there was the Great Depression, there was, Smoot-Hawley tariff in the United States, and then this revival, global revival of protectionism. We can see this here in Bulgaria too, where our government in 1930s introduced not only tariffs, but they introduced quotas, foreign exchange control, and so on and so forth. And this general trend, this increased the tensions between the countries, and they resulted into terrible wars. And of course, you can always make jokes on some of classical liberal notions, because before the outbreak of the First World War, for example, there was a famous prediction that as a result of free trade, there will be no more wars, and then we had war. But in fact, if you are very careful in studying, the causes for wars, quite often you will find lack of free trade, and something else. From the beginning, from the birth of political economy, before Adam Smith, the economists, let's say, they were not professional, most of them economists, but they were in favor of mercantilism, of free trade, against free trade, and so on. And this was combined, their thoughts in favor of protectionism, this was combined quite often with hatred, real hatred for foreigners. And of course, then we had the publication of Wealth of Nations of Adam Smith in 1776, then David Ricardo, and all these great economists that developed all the theoretical arguments, quite sophisticated and really good arguments for free trade. And it's not coincidence that the Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises called the Ricardian law of comparative advantage, which is going to explain why it is good to have an international trade. He termed this law a Ricardian law of association. So as a result of free trade, we could have this association of different people, of different races, if you wish, and so on. So again, from a historical perspective, I think that intellectual history or economic history, history is on our side. Unfortunately, on the side of free trade. Unfortunately for me, these liberal episodes in the human history, not only in human history, but of Balkan history, are quite short. And this is not an optimistic statement, but it is what it is. However, I would like to focus on something else. In communist Bulgaria, because as you said, I'm interested in Bulgarian economic history. In communist Bulgaria, in the beginning of the communist regime, they tried to introduce, under the influence of Stalin, self-sufficiency or isolation. Stalin said to his Bulgarian comrades, you have to produce the steel that you need, you have to extract the oil. If you don't have, you have to work harder to find out where the oil is, and so on and so forth. Of course, this was a total stupidity for a small country on the Balkan Peninsula. And in the later years of the communist regime, they decided to open the country. It was a difficult decision. They were not convinced, free traders, far away from this. but they were forced because of reality to open the country, and this contributed to, in fact, to the fall of communism. So that's one point. And the last point I'd like to make, again, in case of in favor of the case of free trade, this is not exactly an economic history point, but well, it is more humanitarian or literary point. I mean, there was a Bulgarian novelist, dissident writer, Georgi Markov, who, by the way, was murdered by the secret services of the communist regime in London in 1978. So in one of his essays, he writes that as a result of this economic, cultural, and social isolation of Bulgaria under communism, in our country in 1950s, 60s, 70s, there was a real, almost religious cult of the Western commodities. And he writes that it was really a humiliation, real humiliation for society, for individual people to dream of this material stuff. So isolationism is not just a secure road for poverty. Even in just in human terms, it's a humiliation of humans, of ordinary people, and so on and so forth. And of course, I can talk a lot about our opponents and their arguments in historical perspective. But again, speaking of this, all of the attempts artificially by the means of government, by high tariffs or some kind of industrial policy to encourage economic development were not quite successful. On the contrary, they resulted in human suffering, they resulted in corruption, they resulted in unsuccessful attempts to catch up with the developed countries. So that's my point. Of course, thank you for your attention. Hopefully, we're going to have much more time to discuss during the Q&A section. But I know that time is limited. I'm just going to finish with this, that once upon a time, in the times of Adam Smith, he had a chance to convince an important policymaker within a limited time for the case of free trade. Adam Smith was successful, so we are on the shoulder of giants, and we must be optimistic. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We won't have much time, I'm afraid, for discussion, as we're given 1 hour. However, it's interesting that you mentioned China, and here is a question for all of you. China, but also Korea, to some extent Japan, etc., countries from, say, Far East Asia, managed to develop economically, and in China that's obvious, that there is a discrepancy and a clear separation, a division between economic freedom and political freedom. Is there a link? Is it possible to be economically free but not politically? Is there a good reason to justify economic liberalism but not be politically free, liberal, say, progressive, or whatever you call it? Daniel, you have lived in many places, and you have been a keen observer of those processes. What is your take on this question?
Well, I have also studied in China, which might also help to answering this a little bit. And the answer is no. This is not possible. Just look at China. Yes, you can be prosperous if you comply with the system, if you follow the system wants from you. But as soon as you voice a thought of your own that might go against the party doctrine, you're done for. You disappear. and your company works under the general protection, but also the general direction of the state. So you have to live in constant fear that somebody will take away what you have, threaten your life, your family, your friends, if you do not comply. So yes, there can be a degree of prosperity, but there cannot be freedom, because freedom is an ecosystem. Free economic freedom does not only live by its own. If there is a market without rule of law, like Georgiana was pointing into, we have cronyism. This doesn't work. Economic freedom is an expression of your personal freedom. What you do with your life, the decision how you harness the fruit of your labor. And political expression is as well, political freedom is as well an expression of your personal freedom. So if it doesn't exist for the personal sphere, it also doesn't exist for the economic sphere. If you don't have freedom of speech, it's the same. And it's a general misunderstanding how China works. It's the state capitalism that is often quoted. It's not state capitalism because you do not have rule of law. Capitalism needs rule of law to function. Otherwise, it's not that. It's still a steered system with under slightly different pretenses. So just one thing, and that was mentioned about not blaming young people. Well, we still need to protect what's made us successful. There's a very simple equation. The freer the country, the more successful, the less free, the poorer a country. But what you do if you have everything, like in the United States, I know not in all places, I've been there, I've seen it, but in most places, if you don't have hunger, if you can go to school, if you are protected, if you have safety, it's easy to forget where it comes from, especially in this instant gratification world that we are living in. Everything is delivered to you overnight with Amazon Prime, or whatever you want to call it. Uber Eats is delivering you food that you want. Music is coming like this. I mean, I had to go to a record store and buy something, and now I get it for free, more or less. I just have to provide my data. And if you look around, especially in Western countries, there are no battles to be fought anymore when it comes to most part of the freedom that we have. Luckily, in most Western countries, gay people are allowed to marry, and they should, because it's their right, because it's an expression of freedom. In most countries, men and women are equal before the law, as they should be. But if you have everything, you need to rebel against something. And that is where the crux comes into that. And there, Georgiana was again right. Language matters. And it's about some nice sounding phrases that make you feel good, that you can achieve something, that you can rebel against something, to strive for something, even though if you cannot provide any proper solution. And there I come to the blame part. Immanuel Kant said that enlightenment is making use of your own mind. And we have to combine that with an ecosystem that rewards taking economic risk and ingenuity, which is the road to success. And if you forget that, even though you are the most educated generation ever, yes, I can blame you, at least in part, but I certainly will blame your teachers.
Thank you. There are many questions here coming on the chat. I'll try to summarize them by finding, say, a common line for some of them, at least, and especially one of them coming from a friend of ours, Federico Fernandez. He points at something, but not only him. He points at the fact that perhaps. And what is your take on this? There could be concerns which are outside the realm of economics. He takes the example of environmental concerns when it comes to trade with, say, southern countries. And that those environmental concerns or social concerns, as it was mentioned in the example with the sweatshops producing shoes in Southeastern Asia, would then be a justification for comprehensive trade agreements which would go beyond free trade and which would impose some rules which would be good, or regulations which would be not that good to those producers. In terms of international free trade, do we have the moral authority to request those rules and regulations be respected by our trade counterparts? Georgiana, you're the lawyer.
I think it's I think it's pretty commonsensical, because we were talking about the free market and we were talking about economics and politics, and these things, just like Daniel said, you can't separate them. You can't have one and then not have the other. If on an international level there is something that is wrong, and even on a national level, I mean, you see this with companies and you see this all the time. There's something wrong with a company, and then it goes out and people find out. What happens? What's the first thing that happens? They boycott it. People don't buy their stuff anymore. So one of the most important things in this in this environment is that the consumer is the one that holds all the chips. So if there's something that a company is missing, if there's something that a company is doing that you don't agree with, if there's something that's happening in the free market, you can just say, I'll take my money somewhere else. I'm not gonna use this. I'm not gonna buy from them. A country can even say that. It depends. So you can, in terms of morality, I think that there is this switch that the consumer has. It's the only time that you really do have a direct effect. You have less of an effect in politics and voting than you do when it comes to where you put your money on the free market. It is up to you. It is ultimately up to you. And I believe in this self-regulating system where I don't like what that company's doing. I don't like the way it's doing it. And there is another company out there offering me some, if of course you don't have barriers to entry for other companies to compete with that particular companies, those barriers to entry that come from the government themselves. And I have to stop on this whole blaming the young generation thing because it's been so discussed. And there is an element of that. But for me, to ignore the young generation and their future and to say, I've lived a great life. It's wonderful. I live in capitalism. If you want socialism, go ahead, have socialism. That's the opposite of love. That's ignoring what's going to happen to these young people in the future. So our idea of educating them is not to show them, well, young person, let me tell you how you should live your life. No, it's saying, look, we've been through this. Generations before us have been through this, have been through really hard times. Let me tell you where your freedom comes from so you understand it, so you can live a good life and your children can live a good life, because I care about you. It's not about necessarily blaming them as much as it is about really caring about their future. If you didn't care, we wouldn't be having this conversation. And that's, you know, we have children and we'll have children, or we have people who we care about what happens to them. And another point as to why you can't really separate politics and economics is because if you have the rule of law, the point of that is that the law is there to protect you, the individual. You have a social contract with the state, and it is there working for you. You're not the one that's supposed to be working for the state. The state is supposed to be working for you, protecting your freedoms and protecting everything that you need to have protected, for which you then pay some taxes that nobody likes, but they're necessary to a certain degree, right? But if all of a sudden you have something that's like a free market, but the state works for itself, and it takes away your opportunity to do things for yourself, for your own self-interest, there's no way those two things are compatible. They both are supposed to work for you. The state is supposed to protect your freedom to pursue your self-interest on the free market. And in return, you make the state and that world and environment that you live in more prosperous. That's how that's supposed to work. Crony capitalism in China, let's wait a few years and see what happens with that. So that's my view.
Indeed, let's wait a few years. But what you mentioned here and what you point at is, of course, economic institutions, and the market itself is, and we have defined it as such as an institution. But Pencho, we know from history, when we read it correctly, that the world is a better place in material terms, and that's due to free trade. But what about the cultural, social impact of free trade? Does free trade do any good to any other domains outside the domain of the economy, or shall we just take it as it is and take it or leave it, basically?
Well, of course, first of all, we have to admit, and this is very, very important, that cultural norms are extremely important for economic development. And this is also one important ingredient for human prosperity and flourishing, a part of free trade. So there is quite sophisticated, there are quite sophisticated relations between culture and free trade. But let me just give you one quite simple example. There are no more human sacrifices in, let's say, Latin America right now. Why? Because of these interrelations that happened as a result of the age of discoveries. Of course, other things, other bad things happen too, but in fact, we don't have these human sacrifices. So that's one point. And of course, hopefully, we're going to have some chance to discuss this topic about blaming younger generations. I'm much on the side of Georgiana and Daniel, but I mean that's of course another topic. I'm not going to go too deep into this. Just one point: we have to be honest on the other point that you made in the beginning about China and other countries. Well, look, China is a totally different world. But if we think about, let's say, Singapore, well, there is political freedoms there. Well, they are limited, to say at least. And they had economic freedom, so it seems that they are to some extent compatible. China is a quite huge country. We don't have to forget that it is a communist country, which decided to have a little bit of capitalism and freedom, and they had this prosperity as a result of this. So it's quite complicated question again. I mean, that. And of course, Hong Kong is another example of a small country with prosperity, but under China, they're losing, unfortunately, they're losing their political freedoms in recent months and the last year or two. So that's it. Thank you.
Yes, indeed. Well, we're a little bit out of time here now, so we will conclude very quickly. It seems that it is always needed to remind that free trade is just a tool. The market is not itself the goal. It is the instrument which can allow us to improve our own condition and to some extent the condition of everybody around. So it is an ongoing struggle, and despite some setbacks, I want to remain moderately optimistic about our battle of ideas here. Now we have to, of course, thank all of our panelists here: Georgiana from Detroit, Daniel from Brussels, and Pencho from Sofia. And of course, to remind you all that we'll have yet another event with the Free Market Roadshow tomorrow, June 9 at 5 p.m. That shall be Central European time in Warsaw in Poland. It will be hosted by the Civil Development Forum. The topic for tomorrow's event is the growing welfare state and its consequences. The keynote there will be by Barbara Kolm from the Austrian Economic Center on welfare and the nanny state, protection now and subjugation tomorrow. The debate will be moderated by Marek Tatala, and the panelists will include Martin Ögrup, Mateusz Benedict, and Pierre Garello, who happened to be my professor in microeconomics many, many years ago at l'Université Aix-Marseille in southern France. Thank you all. Thank you, the Free Market Roadshow. See you next year. Bye-bye.